Hi, I'm Lindsay, and the topic that I want to talk about today is why am I suffering? I know a lot of you may be asking yourselves this question. There's a lot going on in the world right now. You may be having, emotional issues, mental issues, family issues, financial issues. There are a number of things that can cause you to feel like your life is just falling apart, and you may be asking yourself why, especially if you are a believer in Christ, and if you are keeping the commandments of God, and if you're seeking His face. You may be wondering, well, what am I doing wrong? So today I want to talk about 7 different reasons why you may be suffering. Okay, so reason number 1 that I want to talk about is my sin. And of course, I don't mean me personally, my sin. I mean your sin may be causing you to suffer. Romans 6:23 says that the wages of sin is death. And we know that sin separates us from God. So separation from God, Yahweh, who is the source of all life, of course brings death and suffering. And death might mean several different things. It doesn't always mean, well, yeah, I'm going to die. It's just like the serpent told Eve in the garden, which wasn't a complete lie. He told her that if she were to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that she would not surely die. And of course she didn't die immediately, but she suffered outside of the garden in a fallen state for hundreds of years before she died. So in your own life, sin may be bringing death in your finances, so to speak. You might be bringing the death of your health. You might be having chronic illnesses or chronic pains. It might bring the death of your marriage, the death of your relationships, friendships, the death of your peace, your inner peace. You could be suffering in your mind because of sin. And the real danger of sin, any sin really, is just that it opens up the opportunity for Satan and all of his helpers to wreak havoc in your life, because whatever sin you commit is going to be you choosing another way or another God, really, over Yahweh. If you disobey His commandments, say if you tell a lie, you know that one of His commandments is thou shalt not lie. So in lying, you have chosen another God. You have, whatever the reason might be in that situation for you to lie, you felt that it was more important than serving the Lord your God. So if you are a chronic liar, then you're making that choice over and over again. And so that opens up doors for demonic influence in your life. It gives them the ability to torment you at will, because you have basically made a declaration in the spirit world that Yahweh is not your God. If you do not keep His commandments, if you willingly disobey them, then you have basically told Him that you don't want or need His hedge of protection around you. And we as believers in Christ do have grace by His blood. When we make mistakes, we are still afforded the opportunity to repent of those mistakes for a while. But as we can see in Romans chapter 1, if we are just belligerent and rebellious, and we reject Yahweh long enough, eventually He will just give us over to our sinful desires. That's in Romans chapter 1, verses 22 through 32. And I don't want to read the entire thing, but it's basically just saying that Yahweh lost patience with sinners, and so He gave them over to vile affections, and basically just allowed them to destroy themselves through the sin that they chose, because they refused to acknowledge Him as Creator, the sovereign Creator. And any true believer knows that a life lived in sin and lived without Yahweh is really no life at all. It can really be painful because it just slowly destroys you. For example, in verses, let me see, I'm going to read starting with verse 26. It says, "For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful," and so on. So all of these are very unpleasant tendencies, which, if practiced long enough and reveled in, they could end up destroying a person and bringing a great deal of suffering into their lives. But as it said earlier in the passage, Yahweh gave them over to a reprobate mind. So they actually enjoyed living in murder and deceit and wickedness and homosexuality, etc., because they had given up on their Creator, basically. They refused to acknowledge Him. So they, not only were they pleased in committing these sins, but they were pleased to see others do the same, and probably sought to bring other people into their camp, so to speak, and commit these sins as well. So to sum this up before we move on to the next point, sin in your own life that you commit could be the cause of your suffering, because it opens the doors for Satan and demons to wreak havoc in your life and touch your stuff, so to speak. And it also basically can drive you crazy, because Yahweh will give you over to your reprobate mind and your lustful desires, depending on what your sin is. Any sin that you can't separate yourself from is like a lust of the flesh. So He will give you over to that, and that desire will torment you. And only you can know if this is the cause of your suffering, because only you know what you have going on in your life. But there is one passage I want to read that could maybe help you determine if this could be the cause of your suffering. And it's in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 11, verse 16, and it says, "That they might know that wherewithal a man sinneth, by the same also shall he be punished." So I don't have the context of this passage right now, unfortunately. I think it was referring to the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, and how Yahweh punished the Egyptians. It was sort of in tandem with the way that they had tormented the Israelites, the people of God. I forget the specific example. Might have been in reference to killing their sons in the same way that the Egyptians had killed our sons. So what I'm trying to say is, if you consider the nature of your suffering, and it lines up with something in your life that you are guilty of and maybe have just sort of put on the back burner and forgotten about, or maybe you don't know that it's a sin. I don't know, but this can sort of help you to pinpoint what it might be sometimes. And again, this is not in every case, but this is one of Yahweh's principles. It's one of his ways, is that he will punish a person according to their sin. So that might help you to determine that. So reason number 2 for why you may be suffering is the sin of others. So even if you do your very best to purge sin from your own life and walk uprightly and live righteously before the Lord, you still might suffer because of the sins of someone very close to you, perhaps. Maybe it's causing you to mourn because it hurts you to see how sin is destroying their life, or maybe the consequences of their sin is affecting your life. It might be that you just have people living in proximity to you, in close proximity to you, who are living in sin. Maybe you have sinful neighbors, and they're destroying your peace and causing you to suffer in that way, or they're just bringing the neighborhood down, something like that. And then, of course, we also know that how destructive sinful rulers can be. Job chapter 9 verse 24 says that the earth is given into the hand of the wicked. And we know how Satan tempted Christ and offered him the kingdoms of the world because they were his to give. This fallen world has been given over into wicked hands, and so suffering is abundant in the world because of the sins of a few. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 18 says, "Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroyeth much good." So again, even if you are a righteous person, but you could be suffering because of the sins of someone you may not even know personally. I mean, we have to remember that we are living in a closed system. So the wheat and the tares have been allowed to grow together until the reaping. So the sins of a few may affect everyone, the righteous and the wicked alike. We just have to be prepared for those consequences, and it also gives us incentive to be fishers of men, so to speak, and to bring the wicked into a close, loving relationship with their Creator, and to try to redeem their souls, because everyone can suffer. In Ezekiel chapter 30 verse 12, Yahweh says, "And I will make the rivers dry, and sell the land into the hand of the wicked. And I will make the land waste, and all that is therein by the hand of strangers. I, Yahweh, have spoken it." So that just shows you the destruction that the sin of others, the sins of the wicked, can bring, is that he will actually use them to destroy something that is in perfectly good condition. So the same principle applies to us. Sometimes the sins of the wicked can affect us, can cause us to suffer. So this is perhaps a much less desirable, I guess you could say, reason for suffering, because, there's not too much that you can do about it besides if you know the person who is causing this suffering in your life, and they're committing the sin, you can speak with them in love about it, or you can just pray for them. If there are sinful rulers, of course, you can pray and fast about things like that. And in that same vein, there is the matter of generational curses, the sins of our fathers and mothers. And this is kind of a strange and touchy subject in the Bible, because it seems to be contradictory. Let me go into it for a second. It's just in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 through 7, for example. I'll read that. It says, "And Yahweh passed by before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children, into the third and to the fourth generation." So from this passage and several others, this same phrasing is used, is that Yahweh will visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. And there's also another passage where he says, for example, because you have forgotten my law, I will also forget your children. So we know that the sins of our fathers can affect our lives. Their iniquity will be visited upon us. And so that seems unfair, right? So why should I be suffering for the sins of my great grandparents or whatever? But then in Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 19 through 20, it says, "Yet ye say, Why? Doth not the Son bear the iniquity of the Father? When the Son hath done that which is lawful and right, and hath kept all my statutes, and hath done them, he shall surely live. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him." So, in other words, the sins of our fathers definitely can and will affect us. The children of Israel, when they decided to break the covenant that they had with Yahweh, their children suffered for that. But as we see in this passage, and throughout the books of Kings, you can see that whenever a generation of children decided, okay, we're not going to live apart from our God, we're going to serve him, even though we may be suffering for the sins of our fathers right now, we're going to do what's right in his eyes. Then he will remove that suffering from the souls who decide to serve him. So it's not that we're completely out of control regarding the suffering we may receive for the iniquity of our foreparents. It's just that we sort of receive more pressure to change our ways and make different choices than they made, basically. So moving on to the third reason why you may be suffering, that is time and chance. You may be familiar with that phrase from the book of Ecclesiastes, King Solomon. It was Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11, and it says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. So, of course, this is the most existential book of the Bible. King Solomon, he just had a lot of wisdom, and he sort of saw the way the world worked, and it just sort of made him melancholy, basically. But this is a true principle, that even though Yahweh is sovereign and he is in control, and he definitely guides the lives of the righteous, and he makes efforts to redeem the wicked and rebellious. Even so, sometimes things just happen, and that's what Solomon meant by time and chance. It's like, even the most talented person in the world, they may not make it, so to speak. The smartest person in the world may never invent anything, or just the things that we expect would happen. It's like, if you have A, then B. It just doesn't always happen that way. And this can cause suffering in a person's life, because it just makes everything seem sort of futile. It might feel like, well, why am I even trying to live righteously or to live a good life if things can just happen to me for no reason? It doesn't seem fair. Of all the reasons that I am going over today, this one is probably the most difficult to deal with, because we as humans, we like to look for order. We like to try and make sense of things, because we have a need to know, like our father and mother, basically. When bad things happen, we need a reason, but there always isn't one. Sometimes it just happens. So that's not to say that Yahweh can't sort of take these unfortunate situations or outcomes or what have you and turn them around for good and give them a purpose in your life. It's just that we live in a fallen world, and so the sin that has been brought into the world has caused an element of chaos. So it's hard to bring order out of chaos, but of course we serve an all-powerful and loving God, so he is able to do that. But we just have to accept somehow that time and chance do happen to all men. This is a temporary place of residence for us. So we have to learn how to take things as they come and deal righteously with them. We have to be careful not to, blame God for these sort of chance happenings. At the end of it all, we will be held accountable for how we respond to everything that comes into our lives, whether it was merited or not. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 44 through 45, Yahushua says, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust." So, in other words, everyone is subjected to the same sort of treatment, more or less, the righteous and the wicked alike. But how we respond to what comes into our lives is what determines whose child we are, whether we are the children of Yahweh or the children of Satan. So moving on to the fourth reason why you may be suffering is to be tried. And I guess this sort of continues from the point I was just making about how we respond to the things that come into our lives. Is that, sometimes bad things are allowed to happen to us so that we can be proven, so that it can be shown where our hearts really are at the end of the day. And the most notorious example of this is Job. And I'll just read a couple of passages from that book just to show you what really happened. Job chapter 1, verse number 8. "And Yahweh said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God, and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered Yahweh and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made a hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." So here we have a righteous man just going about his life. Everything is, hunky-dory or whatever. And then we have Satan, the accuser, coming before God to say, he hasn't really been vetted. His life has been all good. So, if you allow him to suffer, he's going to turn around and curse you to your face. So it could be that the suffering in your life is to prove you. Maybe you have been noticed in the spirit world for your righteousness, and maybe Yahweh just wants to take you to another level and see just how deep your love for him really goes. It might not be that he has anything against you or anything like that. It's just that he wants to know if you will still love him, even if you lose everything. Then in chapter 2 of Job, verse number 3, it says, "And Yahweh said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him, to destroy him without cause." So, this just lets you know that when suffering comes into your life, that Yahweh, Satan, everyone is paying attention in the spirit world. So you want to be careful how you respond to your suffering and how you speak about it, how you speak about your Creator, and basically just watch yourself, because it can be very tempting to speak negatively and make bad choices and what have you when suffering comes into your life, especially when you really don't understand why. But these are the times that you really have an opportunity to shine. And before I move on from this point, I just want to clarify the fact, because I know some people may say, well, Satan doesn't have the ability to accuse the brethren anymore. He can't come before Yahweh's throne and tempt him to be moved against us for no reason. But then in the New Testament, we sort of have the same situation, basically. In Luke chapter 22, verses 31, it says, "And the Lord said," this is Christ, Yahushua, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat." So this principle carries over even now that we have, our Savior, and Satan has been cast out of heaven, but we are still subject to suffering as a way to test us and sift us as wheat. So reason number 5 as to why you may be suffering is to be refined, or in other words, strengthened and purified. The prime example of this sort of suffering in the Bible, I think at least, is with Joseph, and how he he was betrayed by his own brothers and sold into slavery and spent 13 years in servitude and in prison, but all of this was for the purpose of strengthening him and breaking his trust in man, and purifying his soul of maybe the pride that he had in his youth. The reason that he received so much hate from his brothers was just that he was so highly favored by his father, Jacob, and he wasn't shy about it at all, and he wasn't shy about his dreams either, which of course were from Yahweh because they came to pass. But his brothers not receiving the favoritism of their father, they didn't want to hear, oh, we're going to be bowing down to you? Well, great, okay. So he had to be humbled through the process of suffering from the time that he was 17 until he was 30, the Bible tells us. But at the end of that, he was able to interpret dreams and, give credit to Yahweh for the interpretation of those dreams. He had learned how to properly manage an estate, to manage resources, which is, of course, the reason that he was able to gather so much wheat into the storehouses to help sustain Egypt and all the surrounding nations through a horrible famine. So his suffering basically, it brought out the best in him so that he was able to contribute to basically the saving of who knows how many lives, thousands, millions, I'm not sure, but it was a lot. So for you personally, the cause of your suffering could be for the same reason that Joseph went through so much. It's just that maybe Yahweh has something planned for you that he's trying to get you ready for. And I know that, he's preparing you for something greater is the reason why you're suffering. That sort of phrase, or that idea, has almost been made a cliche in the Christian church. I mean, it's so overused, but the fact is that it's true, because you can't bring out the best in a vessel without applying some kind of heat or pressure or something unpleasant to it. It's just not possible. It has to be prepared and refined. And that concept of refining is seen throughout the Bible. In, let me see, what is this? Isaiah, for example. I've got Isaiah and Ezekiel here. There's several examples, but Isaiah chapter 1, and I'll read verses 19 through 28. This concept is applied to the children of Israel as a people. It says that, if ye be willing and obedient, ye shall eat the good of the land. But if ye refuse and rebel, ye shall be devoured with the sword, for the mouth of Yahweh hath spoken it. How is the faithful city become an harlot? It was full of judgment, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Thy silver is become dross, thy wine mixed with water. Thy princes are rebellious, and companions of thieves. Every one loveth gifts, and followeth after rewards. They judge not the fatherless, neither doth the cause of the widow come unto them. Therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, I will ease me of mine adversaries, and avenge me of mine enemies. And I will turn my hand upon thee, and purely purge away thy dross, and take away all thy tin. And I will restore thy judges as at the first, and thy counselors as at the beginning. Afterward thou shalt be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. Zion shall be redeemed with judgment, and her converts with righteousness. And the destruction of the transgressors and of the sinners shall be together, and they that forsake Yahweh shall be consumed. So, here we have an example of the children of Israel turning away from Yahweh. A city that was once pure and beautiful with righteousness, filled with righteousness, became basically a dump in his eyes, and he wanted to purge away the sin and wickedness. So he said he will purge away the dross, as in he will apply pressure to it. He will turn his hand against it in order to rid the city and the people of the undesirable parts. So they had to undergo suffering in order to be purified again. And the other example of this, which I won't read, but you can read for yourself, is in Ezekiel chapter 22, verses 18 through 22. And basically this concept applies to the entire world. The souls of all men. That's really the purpose of this life. Basically, is just that we're here to be sort of separated. It's the weeds and the tares. It's kind of the same thing. So life is full of suffering, just because Yahweh is trying to find those who will serve him and in his kingdom. So as long as we are doing what's right and loving our Creator, keeping his commandments, loving our Savior Yahushua, we can rest assured that our suffering, it is for a purpose. It's allowing us to shine, basically, in a fallen and evil world. So try not to despise your suffering. Reason number 6 as to why you may be suffering is to move you, either physically or emotionally, to move your heart. So physically, an example of that would be how the famine in Egypt brought Joseph's family back to him. And I just want to read in Genesis chapter 41, verses 56 through 57. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses, and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because the famine was so sore in all lands. And the sons, this is chapter 42, verse 5. And the sons of Israel came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. So this famine was more than likely planned or sent by Yahweh to move Joseph's family to come back to him, because if they had just, been chilling in Canaan and everything was all good, they would have had no reason to go to Egypt, and Joseph had no reason to go home, because he probably would have feared for his life to see his brothers again after what they did to him. But, hunger will make a person move. If you don't address it, then you're dead. So you gotta get up and move. So maybe in your life you are suffering because Yahweh wants to move you from, one city to another, one job to another, one relationship to another. Who knows? But your discomfort might be telling you that you need to go somewhere. And that's not always the case, but only you can figure that out. But the example I have for the moving of your heart is Jonah, the reluctant prophet. Suffering caused him to submit to God's will for his life when he was rebellious. It says in Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, "Now the word of Yahweh came unto Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me. But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh, and went down to Joppa." So he was not trying to hear Yahweh. He didn't want to minister to Nineveh, and so he fled instead. But if you know the story of Jonah, it's that he got on this ship, and it was beaten by a mighty storm to the point where the unbelieving crew threw him off of the ship. Eventually, they figured out that the storm was plaguing them because he was on it. So they cast him into the sea, as he asked them to do, and he spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish, which could not have been pleasant. That was his point of suffering, but eventually it was, I guess it was so bad that he cried out to God, and it moved his heart and changed his mind. So Yahweh had the fish spit him out onto the shores, and he went ahead and complied with Yahweh's will. So, except for when it comes to knowing rebellion against God, like in Jonah's case, where you have a charge from Yahweh to do something and you're just not doing it. If it's not a case like that, then sometimes this particular reason for suffering can be tricky, because moving from one situation to another, or whatever the case might be, there's always the potential for error. Sometimes Yahweh wants you to stay in a situation of suffering, sometimes he doesn't. It can be a little scary. So with this one, just as a word of caution, I would advise that you pray about it first. So the last point that I want to make, number 7, is to the reason why you may be suffering is for the glory of God. My mother asked me a question about the children of Israel, and she was just like, well, why were they allowed to go through such horrible suffering and slavery in Egypt. And that was before they were given the law. They were just living peacefully there, and then all of a sudden they just get, tormented by this evil ruler. What happened? It just doesn't seem fair. But my response was just that if they had been allowed to just leave peacefully, if everything had just been copacetic between them and the Egyptians, and and God just led them out, there really wouldn't have been any reason for miraculous signs and wonders. It set up the opportunity for Yahweh to show his power not only to the Egyptians who were living in sin and worshiping false gods, but also to all the nations who heard about their deliverance. And of course, in that situation also, you have to consider the fact that they had been living amongst the Egyptians for so long. It is possible that actually, and very likely, considering how they behaved after they got out, it's likely that they had begun worshiping the gods of the Egyptians and adopting their ways. So that more than likely led to the removal of their sort of hedge of protection by Yahweh. But barring that, the same principle still applies, is that sometimes, Yahweh just has to create an undesirable situation in order to bring glory to himself. And sometimes that's sort of hard to deal with. It's like, my people or me, like, we went through all of this horrible slavery and being murdered and families torn apart and just living in poverty, just like, this is awful. And all of this for the glory of God. But that's kind of what you want. It should be what you want, because we serve the most wonderful, loving, all-powerful God. He is the only true living God, and we want his miracle-working power to be known amongst the nations. And if we can be used, if we can be a part of that, then that's a wonderful thing. And it's not only wonderful for the joy that we experience when that deliverance finally does come, but it's also wonderful because the souls of the people who turn to your God, once you allow yourself to be used by him, those are counted as stars. You get a crown of stars upon your head in the spirit world, basically. It is our responsibility as his people and as believers to try to redeem the unbelieving and lost souls in this world. So, of course, suffering hurts, and all this waiting and everything, it's painful, but in the end, it's for a good cause. And I just want to read in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. This is an example of Yahweh himself telling you about this principle. And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. So this poor man spent his whole life blind, but to that same effect, he got to experience the joy and the wonder of the miracle working power of the Son of God himself. Not many people can say that. I mean, yeah, it's nice to live a comfortable life, but I mean, would you rather just have everything just be flat and just boring your whole life, or, have some ups and downs? It makes life interesting. So, um, and that's also why I say you shouldn't despise your suffering, because, I mean, especially if you keep a positive attitude and just keep your heart pure and keep seeking Yahweh, keep seeking your Creator, and one day it'll be worth it. So those are the 7 reasons for suffering that I've got. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments section.